I was jolted awake by the sound no solar engineer ever wants to hear at 2 a.m., a surge alarm screaming from my grid console like a banshee on fire. I stumbled out of bed, half asleep, eyes still adjusting, and stared in disbelief as my inverter showed an unexplained load spike of over 11 kilowatts. That was nearly triple the average nightly draw, and the source was marked as my outdoor port. Confused and furious, I threw on a hoodie and stormed outside with a flashlight and my phone in hand, only to see a sleek white Tesla Model X glowing beneath the moonlight, plugged neatly into my private solar charger. And standing beside it, arms crossed like she owned the galaxy, was Karen from the HOA. She looked me dead in the eye and said, with zero shame, "Your charger wasn't being used overnight." I figured I'd save a few bucks. I blinked, wondering if I was dreaming. I wasn't. That moment rewired my understanding of just how entitled someone could be. See, I built that solar grid myself. As an electrical systems engineer, I designed every wire, every battery bank, and every inch of my off-grid setup with meticulous care. It wasn't just about energy, it was about independence. And here was this woman, who'd already tried to fine me for having unapproved solar panels visible from the street, now quietly jacking electricity for her luxury car like she was borrowing a cup of sugar. My system had safeguards, of course, but I hadn't planned for this level of HOA arrogance. Not yet. The first time I saw Karen was during the HOA's annual meeting, where she volunteered to become the treasurer and was promptly elected by default since no one else wanted the job. That should have been our warning. She immediately began referring to herself as Executive Officer of Community Standards and started throwing her weight around, slapping people with fines for ridiculous things. Mailboxes not being the right shade of beige, kids' bikes left on porches, and my favorite, excessively green grass, which was apparently unfair to other residents. Most neighbors just rolled their eyes and complied to avoid the hassle. I, on the other hand, made the mistake of installing an outdoor battery housing near the fence. It matched my house. It was legal. But according to Karen, it invited property theft and visual disharmony. That's when she first tried to flex her fake authority, telling me to move the unit or face escalating fees. I showed her my city-approved permits and explained that my system was off-grid, fully compliant, and none of her concern. She didn't like that. The next week, I received a formal HOA warning letter printed in Comic Sans. I laughed, tossed it into my shredder, and carried on. But now, this wasn't about aesthetic preferences. She had crossed the line from annoying busybody to full-blown power thief. As I stood in my driveway staring at the Tesla's humming charger, I asked her if she was serious. "You can't just plug into someone's private energy system, Karen," I said, trying to stay calm. She looked confused, then smug. "You put it on the outside of your house," she said, as if that gave her the right. "And since we're all part of the same community, technically the energy belongs to everyone." I was stunned by the logic. She was treating my custom-engineered system like a shared garden hose. I reminded her, again, that the HOA had nothing to do with my power grid. She rolled her eyes and said, "You should be grateful I'm charging clean. I'm not burning gas." That's when I knew this was war. I didn't shout. I didn't yank the cable out or throw a fit. I just walked back inside, opened my console, and recorded the logs. The grid showed a 73% drain from her vehicle in just over 4 hours. That was nearly a full charge, translating to dozens of dollars, and wear on my battery cells. Multiply that by how many times she'd done it before, without my knowledge, and the theft was no longer minor. I pulled surveillance footage from my driveway cams. Sure enough, there she was on multiple occasions sneaking into the side yard at night, plugging in, then casually walking away like it was a public outlet. It wasn't an accident. It was a pattern. The next morning, I walked over to her house, knocked, and calmly explained everything, again. I offered to let it go if she agreed to stop and reimburse a portion of what she had taken. I even printed the data for her. She smirked and said, "Oh please. You really think I'm paying you for sunlight?" Then she closed the door in my face. Later that week, she had the audacity to file a complaint against me through the HOA, claiming I was hoarding renewable energy in an exclusionary manner. I thought it was a joke until I got another violation notice in my mailbox. She accused me of anti-community behavior, and claimed her rights as a board member gave her access to external utility infrastructure. My blood boiled. I wasn't about to play defense anymore. That night, I decided I'd had enough. She wanted power? Fine. I'd give her all the power she could handle. I spent the next few evenings designing a dummy port, a decoy outlet rigged with a safe but intentionally unstable surge loop. The moment she plugged into it again, it would trip a concealed relay that dumped non-lethal, chaotic voltage through the line. It wouldn't harm her or the car permanently, but it would fry the charger and scare the life out of her. All within technical safety limit. All completely legal. By Friday, the trap was in place, hidden behind a faux access panel that looked just like my real charger. A big yellow sign warned Private Grid, "Do not use," but I knew she'd ignore it. Karen never saw a boundary she didn't want to cross. I didn't have to wait long. Saturday night, around 1:40 a.m., my console lit up again with a surge alert. I leaned back in my chair, smiled, and brought up the camera feed. And there she was, Karen in pajama pants and a hoodie, humming to herself while plugging her cable into my decoy port. 10 seconds later, the Tesla jolted, hissed, and shot a blinding arc of sparks out of the charger socket. Karen screamed and stumbled back, falling onto her lawn like a cartoon villain. The car went dark. The camera captured every second, and in that moment, with the night glowing like the 4th of July and Karen yelling, "It's broken!" into the darkness, I realized I had just declared electrical war on the most entitled person in the neighborhood. And I was just getting started. The next morning, I expected retaliation. What I didn't expect was a mob. I was halfway through my coffee when I heard a knock on the door, not a gentle one, either. It was a rapid, angry thumping, the kind that announces someone not looking for a conversation but a confrontation. I opened it to find Karen, arms folded, flanked by 2 HOA board members I barely recognized. Her Tesla sat in the driveway behind her like a wounded animal, the charger still dangling from its port, blackened and limp. Karen's expression looked like she had bitten into a lemon soaked in vinegar. "You tampered with my car," she snapped without so much as a good morning. One of the board members, a guy named Leonard who always wore sandals with socks, stepped forward nervously and said, "We just want to talk about what happened last night." I told them to wait and stepped inside. I came back with a folder. Inside were printouts of every recorded instance Karen had used my power port without permission, with timestamps and video stills included. I handed it to Leonard, who blinked at the growing pile of paper like I'd just handed him a lawsuit, which wasn't too far from reality. Karen snatched one of the papers and held it up. "This doesn't prove anything. It was outside, no lock, no sign until recently." I gestured toward the video camera mounted over the driveway and said, "There's audio too. In case you forgot, last night you said, and I quote, 'I figured I'd save a few bucks.'" Leonard's face fell slightly, and the second board member, Diane, looked downright uncomfortable. Karen's confidence cracked, but she wasn't the type to retreat. She doubled down. "I'm filing an HOA complaint for sabotage. You damaged my property," she said. I shrugged. "Your unauthorized use tripped a surge on a decoy port. That's not my problem. It's documented. You ignored the warnings. You trespassed. And if you want to talk damage, let's talk about what your charging did to my battery bank." She didn't care. She was already turning back to her car, calling someone on speaker and telling them to prepare a formal incident response. That same afternoon, I received a hand-delivered letter, another violation notice from the HOA, this time for installing dangerous electrical equipment without board approval. I laughed so hard I almost dropped it in the recycling bin. Instead, I kept it, knowing it would look fantastic stapled to the counter-complaint I was preparing. I dealt with technical disputes my whole career, but I never imagined I'd be documenting an energy theft case for neighborhood drama. Still, I knew how to play the long game. I reached out to my lawyer, a former litigator who now handled property law and tech infrastructure dispute. After reviewing my footage, logs, and the HOA's absurd violation letters, he agreed we had a case for trespassing, utility theft, and defamation. But before we went that route, he advised one more thing. Put Karen in a legal corner first. Let her show her cards. The HOA's weakness is their paper trail. They don't want lawsuits, they want compliance. And they mess up when someone fights back with evidence. So I got organized. I printed everything, every voltage spike, every video frame, every recorded word. I sent a cease and desist letter through my lawyer, delivered to Karen and CC'd to the HOA board. Within it, I included a formal demand to stop all attempts to access my energy infrastructure or face civil litigation. That was the legal part. For the fun part, I installed a digital display sign at the edge of my property, powered by the solar grid, of course. It cycled messages like private energy zone, trespassers will be fried legally, and stealing sunlight? Really, Karen? It was cheeky. It was bright. It was impossible to miss. And boy, did it stir the pot. By the weekend, people were talking. Neighbors began stopping by to ask what the drama was about. I didn't spread anything, but the footage from the Tesla Zap had apparently made it into the hands of some teenagers across the street, who edited it with dramatic music and uploaded it to social media. The video, titled "Tesla Karen Gets What She Deserves," exploded. Within days, it had over 2 million views. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just the local HOA nuisance. She was internet famous in the worst way possible. The clip showed her plugging in confidently, then jumping back screaming as sparks lit up her luxury car like a Christmas tree. My sign in the background made it even better. The caption read, "That's what you get for stealing volts, Karen." The attention didn't help her case. While she marched around the neighborhood trying to restore her shattered pride, the rest of the HOA board began receiving angry emails from residents who were tired of her antics. A few even thanked me for standing up to her. One guy, Fred from down the street, brought me a 6-pack of beer and said, "You're the hero we didn't know we needed." I wasn't interested in heroism. I was interested in accountability. So when the HOA called an emergency meeting to discuss the energy situation, I showed up ready. The meeting was held in the community center. Karen sat at the front like a queen on trial, face tense, eyes darting around the room. I sat near the back with my folder. Leonard opened by reading the complaints filed, mine included, and then invited Karen to explain herself. She began with the usual. I believed the charger was community accessible due to its external location. There were no initial warnings posted. I only used it during off-peak hours. Then she got defensive. He deliberately tampered with the system to cause damage. He humiliated me in front of everyone. This is harassment. I stood, asked to be heard, and was granted the floor. I calmly laid out the facts, dates, footage, logs. I explained the concept of a closed solar grid, the risks of overdraw, the costs involved. I handed out packets to every board member, each one labeled and indexed. I ended by pointing out the sign that had been installed before the final incident and reminded them of the cease and desist letter now on record. The room was silent. Karen tried to interrupt, but Leonard shut her down. "Karen, you were told not to use that port. You ignored it. This wasn't a mistake. It was repeated, unauthorized access." The vote that followed was swift. The board suspended Karen from her treasurer role pending further review. The violation against me was retracted. An apology was recommended, though no one expected her to deliver one. As I left the meeting, I passed Karen in the parking lot. She glared at me, arms tight across her chest. "This isn't over," she hissed. I smiled and replied, "No, it's just beginning." Because what she didn't know was that I had one more trick up my sleeve. Her Tesla might have sparked, but the real fireworks hadn't even started yet. I thought maybe, just maybe, after the public humiliation and the board suspension, Karen would take the L and retreat into the background like most people do when they become a walking meme. But Karen was not like most people. She didn't just double down, she went full nuclear. 2 days after the HOA meeting, I walked out to grab my mail and noticed something strange. My solar control panel's protective casing had been tampered with. The lock had scratches on it like someone tried to wedge it open. That casing was custom fitted and bolted tight with tamper-proof screws, and only I had the key. My stomach turned. Someone had tried to access the core of my grid system. Not just the charging port. This was the brain of the whole operation. I ran back inside and pulled the security footage from my backyard camera, one of the many I had installed after the previous incidents. There, clear as daylight, at 2:46 a.m., was Karen. Dressed in all black like she was auditioning for a low-budget spy movie, crouching beside my panel, using a small tool to try and pry open the lock. She kept looking over her shoulder, then at one point cursed out loud when her screwdriver slipped. She had no gloves, no mask, just pure, arrogant confidence. I watched her struggle for a few minutes, then give up and storm off. But not before flipping off the camera like it was personal. I sat back, breathing slowly, trying to decide if I was more impressed by her persistence or disgusted by her stupidity. She had already been suspended from the HOA board, was facing civil action, and had her Tesla half fried on camera. And still, she thought she could sneak onto my property and tamper with an electrical system she clearly didn't understand. If she had succeeded, she could have shorted out a major segment of my battery bank, maybe even caused an electrical fire. At that point, it wasn't just entitlement, it was criminal recklessness. That night, I backed up all the video evidence and sent it to my lawyer. Then I called the local sheriff's office. The deputy who came out was named Morales, and he was one of those rare types, calm, intelligent, and genuinely amused by stupidity. After reviewing the footage, he shook his head and said, "Well, she's got guts. I'll give her that. No brains, but guts." He took a statement, marked it as trespassing and attempted vandalism, and assured me they'd pay Karen a visit. Sure enough, the next day, 2 patrol cars parked in front of her house. I watched from my office window as she stood on her porch in fuzzy slippers, arguing with the officers while holding a cup of herbal tea like it was a shield. Her voice carried loud enough for me to hear her say the words, "This is harassment. He's weaponizing the system against me." That was rich, coming from someone who had literally tried to invade my property twice and siphoned off dozens of dollars worth of power over weeks. I figured that was the end of it. Law enforcement was involved now. She'd have to back off. But Karen didn't back off. No, she played her final card. She called the local news. 2 days later, a crew from a regional station showed up in our neighborhood. A silver van with a satellite dish pulled up and a chipper-looking reporter named Chase Laramie stepped out, holding a mic and blinking under the hot sun. He was followed by a cameraman who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I was working on my porch when they approached. Chase gave me a polite smile and said, "Hi there. We're doing a piece on neighborhood disputes and energy access. Do you have a few minutes to chat?" I raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, Karen's your source?" He chuckled awkwardly and said, "Well, we've spoken to a few residents. I told him I'd be happy to talk, on one condition. That I got to show him my side of the story with documentation." He agreed. So I invited him into my workspace and walked him through the whole setup: my off-grid solar array, the smart inverter logs, the surveillance footage, the tamper attempt, and even the viral video of the Tesla spark incident. Chase's eyes got wider with each layer of evidence. The cameraman, who had barely said a word, finally asked, "Wait, she really thought this belonged to the HOA?" I nodded. "And she tried to steal it. Repeatedly. This wasn't about community power. It was about entitlement." Chase left with more than enough to rethink his angle. That night, the segment aired, and it was not the story Karen had hoped for. The report was surprisingly fair. It opened with her speaking about shared community resources and a hostile neighbor, but then cut to the sheriff explaining that Karen was under investigation for trespassing. Then it jumped to me explaining off-grid systems and showing video proof. The anchor wrapped it up by saying, in this case, the sun may be free, but the infrastructure isn't. I laughed so hard I almost dropped my drink. Karen's expression in the interview was priceless. Nervous, twitchy, the look of someone realizing they'd overplayed their hand. After that segment aired, the neighborhood shifted. I started receiving messages from people I barely knew. One man from 3 blocks over wrote, "She fined me for a flagpole being too high. Now I realize she was just full of it." Someone else dropped a note on my porch that said, "Thanks for standing up to the HOA tyrant." And just like that, Karen went from feared board member to community outcast. People crossed the street to avoid her. The Facebook group started sharing memes of her Tesla incident. One had the caption, "When you try to charge for free and end up paying in dignity." But the real blow came when the HOA convened again and this time held a public vote, not just for board reinstatement but for removal. Karen showed up in sunglasses and a scarf, like she was hiding from the paparazzi. She tried to defend herself, saying she was only trying to bring equity to neighborhood energy use. But no one was buying it. The vote was 34-2 in favor of permanent removal. The final twist? Those 2 votes were Karen and her husband, who looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. After the meeting, I walked out and passed by her Tesla parked on the curb. It still hadn't been fully repaired. As I glanced at it, I noticed someone had left a sticker on the back. It read, "Charge responsibly." I didn't put it there, but I appreciated the message. Karen wasn't finished yet. I could feel it. She wasn't the type to surrender. But with every failed attempt, she was running out of cards to play. And I was just getting warmed up. Because if she wanted to keep pressing her luck, I had just begun designing a new system, a fully legal, fully documented anti-leach protocol. The next time she tried anything, the sparks wouldn't just fly. They'd come with consequences written in voltage. If Karen had an off switch, she either didn't know where it was or chose to rip it out long ago. After the news segment, her Tesla debacle became the neighborhood's favorite story to whisper over fences and laugh about during trash day. Her humiliation should have been the final act, but instead it seemed to fuel her like diesel to a fire. 1 week passed in silence, which made me more nervous than her usual antics. Then, just as I thought the chaos might finally be over, she re-emerged with a new strategy, one that made it clear she was done with passive sabotage. She was ready for open war. It started with a letter, not from the HOA this time, but from a local environmental compliance group. The letter accused me of operating an unlicensed energy distribution center, claiming that I was harboring unsafe voltage systems without municipal oversight. At first, I laughed. Then I read the fine print. It was filed through a third-party complaint platform, one that allowed anonymous whistleblowers to submit tips about code violations. Someone had gone out of their way to make it look legitimate. They even listed fake permit violations and misquoted local energy ordinances. It was a clumsy attempt, but it had enough formatting and buzzwords to warrant a city inspection. 3 days later, a compliance officer named Hector showed up at my door. Unlike the HOA goons, Hector was professional and respectful. He asked for a walkthrough and apologized before stepping foot on my property. I invited him in and walked him through the entire solar grid, showed him the installation permits, safety documentation, system logs, and even explained my anti-theft deterrent measures. Hector took photos, nodded frequently, and by the end of the visit, he shook my hand and said, "Honestly, this is one of the safest setups I've seen. Whoever sent that complaint clearly has no idea how power systems work." That confirmed what I already knew. Karen was behind it. Who else would go to that level of pettiness? I knew she wouldn't stop, so I started preparing my final play. But before I could execute it, the universe handed me a perfect opportunity wrapped in the kind of poetic justice you couldn't script better if you tried. One evening, during a neighborhood movie night at the community center, the power went out mid-screening. The projector died, the popcorn machine sputtered to a stop, and every nearby light blinked off, leaving dozens of confused residents sitting in darkness. Panic was minimal. This wasn't the first blackout, but what made this different was that my house, just a block away, was still glowing like a Christmas postcard. Every light was on. My security system was fully operational. My porch fan spun peacefully in the breeze, while the rest of the block fumbled for flashlights. Within minutes, half the crowd was pointing toward my house and whispering. I stayed seated with my soda, trying to enjoy the quiet drama unfolding around me. That's when Karen, red-faced and boiling with frustration, stood up in the middle of the group and declared, "See? This is what happens when someone hoards power. We're all left in the dark while he lives like a king." The irony of her statement was so heavy it practically bent gravity. People around her started rolling their eyes. One woman muttered, "He built that system himself." Another man said, "At least someone has power. Maybe the HOA should invest in solar instead of painting curbs." I didn't say a word. I just got up, walked home, and flipped on my external monitor that displayed live footage from my system's control center. The outage had tripped a fault line in the main grid, a city-level issue. It had nothing to do with me. But the resentment in Karen's voice wasn't about logic. It was pure envy. She couldn't stand that I had something she didn't, something she couldn't control. The next morning, the final straw landed. I caught her again, on camera, sneaking into my backyard. Only this time, she didn't come for the port. She came with a pair of gardening shears and tried to cut the data line running from one of my solar panels to the inverter unit. She must have thought it was a power line. The second she snipped it, the motion sensor triggered an air horn I'd mounted to the panel rig. A piercing scream tore through the morning air, followed by the sound of Karen falling backward and landing in a pile of mulch. I walked outside casually, phone in hand, recording as I approached. Karen was still on the ground, dirt on her elbows, looking more furious than injured. "I was trimming your weeds," she blurted. "You have invasive growth along the fence." I looked at the clearly labeled cable she had tried to sever and said, "That's my sensor line. Touch it again, and you won't just be facing a noise complaint." She stood up, brushed herself off, and stormed off, yelling something about legal gray areas and overreactions. That footage was the final piece I needed. I compiled everything, every violation, every visit, every incident. My lawyer filed a formal restraining order the same day. But I didn't stop there. I wrote up a community proposal and presented it at the next HOA Open Forum. The title? Solar Education and Energy Boundaries Policy. In it, I laid out guidelines for understanding private energy systems, penalties for tampering, and suggestions for neighborhood solar investment opportunities. It was framed as a positive, forward-thinking piece of policy. But everyone knew what it really was, a perfectly disguised middle finger wrapped in bureaucratic gold. To no one's surprise, the proposal passed with overwhelming support. Even Diane, who had been Karen's only remaining ally, voted in favor. Karen wasn't present at the meeting. She'd stopped showing up altogether, hiding in her house like a wounded cat. Her Tesla sat unmoved on the curb, still bearing the battle scars from her midnight charging adventure. Someone had placed a solar-powered garden gnome on its hood. No one knew who did it, but it wore sunglasses and held a sign that read, "Respect the current." At night, I could see my system glowing quietly, its power humming in perfect order. The chaos had finally started to settle. Karen had run out of moves, and the neighborhood had chosen reason over drama. But I wasn't just satisfied with the win. I wanted to ensure no one ever tried anything like this again. So I started building a small display box, mounted on the front post of my property. Inside it, I planned to place Karen's melted Tesla charger cable, the one that had sparked so beautifully that night, as a permanent reminder. Not just to her, but to anyone else who might one day think it was okay to steal from someone who'd spent years building something with passion, skill, and patience. My energy grid wasn't just wires and watts. It was a fortress. And Karen had learned, the hard way, that when you poke the current, you get shocked. Karen disappeared from the neighborhood's social scene like a storm that finally blew itself out. The woman who once proudly marched around issuing fines for misaligned trash bins and unauthorized lawn decor was now reduced to peeking through her blinds while pretending she didn't care. Her Tesla remained parked in the same spot, the melted charger port still unrepaired, like a monument to hubris. People walked past it quietly, some with smirks, some shaking their heads, but no one dared move it. Everyone knew the story now. The woman who tried to steal solar energy from a private grid and got electrosmacked by karma. But as far as I was concerned, things weren't finished until I had legal closure, and a little creative closure too. My lawyer called to confirm that the judge had granted the restraining order. Karen was officially barred from setting foot on my property or tampering with any of my equipment. The order included an extensive breakdown of her trespassing incidents, attempted sabotage, and energy theft, all backed by video evidence. If she so much as reached over my fence, she'd be facing criminal charges. I knew that would sting worse than any fine. Karen valued control. Losing it publicly was the greatest punishment of all. Around the same time, the HOA held its quarterly review meeting and invited me to speak. Apparently, my proposed solar education policy had sparked enough interest that neighboring communities were inquiring about adopting similar guidelines. So there I was, standing in front of the same group of people who once avoided eye contact with me, now applauding and taking note. I explained how solar independence didn't mean community exclusion, but that boundaries needed to be respected. Property meant responsibility. Energy wasn't something you could just tap into because it was outside. You wouldn't walk into someone's garage and borrow their tools without asking. Why was electricity any different? The meeting ended with a small surprise. The board voted to reimburse me for the damages Karen caused, using the HOA's discretionary emergency budget. That was the cherry on top, getting compensated by the same organization that once backed her absurd violations. As I walked home that evening, I felt a strange kind of peace. The battle was over. The storm had passed. And the grid, my grid, hummed along with perfect calm. But the final moment of satisfaction came a few days later when a delivery arrived at my door. It was a wooden crate, neatly packed, with a note taped to the top that simply read, "For the trophy room." I opened it to find Karen's original Tesla charging cable, the one that had melted and blackened during her infamous unauthorized plug-in. It had been recovered by the towing service that finally came to remove her car after the HOA declared it an eyesore. The company, having seen the viral footage, thought I might want a souvenir. And oh, did I! That weekend, I got to work. I mounted the charger inside a glass shadow box with a steel label that read, "Tamper with the sun, get burned." I placed it next to my gate, just under the solar status screen, so anyone walking by could enjoy a clear view. It didn't take long before neighbors started taking selfies with it. Some thought it was art. Some called it a lesson in modern justice. Kids nicknamed it the Zap Relic. One teenager even said, "Bro, this is better than any no trespassing sign." I agreed. The weeks that followed were blissfully quiet. No knocks on the door. No fake citations. No passive-aggressive messages. Karen had retreated entirely. I later learned she put her house up for sale, claiming she needed a change of scenery. But everyone knew the truth. Her reputation was shot, her influence obliterated, and her ego permanently scorched. The house lingered on the market too. Buyers kept pulling out, citing neighborhood gossip as a concern. One real estate agent even admitted that the viral video had affected interest. "People ask about the crazy Tesla lady," she said. "It's kind of become folklore." I didn't gloat much. But I wasn't shy about protecting what I'd built, either. I continued refining the system, added a new backup battery array, upgraded the smart load balancer, and expanded the decoy port just in case someone else thought about trying their luck. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. Once you've had someone crawl around your yard with a screwdriver and garden shears pretending to be a crusader for communal electricity, you tend to learn your lesson. Then came the letter. This time it wasn't from Karen. It was from the city. Apparently, they'd seen the news segment, read the follow-up blog posts, and even heard about the HOA reforms. They wanted to nominate me for a local sustainability award. I laughed out loud when I read it. Not because I didn't appreciate it, but because I realized how far we'd come from a woman plugging her car into someone else's power outlet like it was her personal socket. What started as petty theft turned into a conversation about independence, boundaries, and the importance of owning your energy. And if that conversation had to begin with a little fire and a fried Tesla cable, so be it. The award ceremony was held at the Civic Center. It was low-key, nothing fancy. Folding chairs, a modest stage, and a few plaques handed out to people making eco-friendly efforts in the city. When they called my name, I walked up to polite applause, accepted the plaque, and kept my speech short. I said, "Respect your neighbors. Respect the grid. And never underestimate the pettiness of people who don't understand either." That got a few laughs. Even the mayor chuckled. When I returned home that night, I stood in front of my property and looked at the system I had built. The panels, the batteries, the inverters, all glowing steady and clean. I thought about all the drama, the schemes, the sabotage, and the sparks. And then I thought about the final image of Karen, covered in mulch, screaming at an air horn, the cords of her empire fraying in the dirt. She thought power meant control. She thought she could just take and take without consequence. But she didn't understand that real power doesn't come from a title or a vote or a charger you didn't ask permission to use. It comes from knowing what's yours, defending it with facts, and letting the voltage do the rest. And as the sun dipped behind the horizon and my grid kicked into its nightly sequence, I leaned on the gate and smiled. I didn't need to say anything. The current spoke for itself.